We're picking up in the book of Galatians, and this is a little different than some of the other letters to Paul. They're to cities like Ephesus and Colossae and Philippi. Galatians is to a province or to a region. Galatia is not a town, although we have a town close to us called Galatia. This letter wasn't written to a town, but to a province. Basically, it's in Turkey, modern-day Turkey, which would be called Asia Minor, or Asia in the Bible, and the area we call more like Asia Minor today. So Paul writes the letter. This last one we looked at in 2 Corinthians, he was pretty well defending his apostleship. He was talking about why he is an apostle and that kind of thing to the Corinthians because they were having a hard time just receiving authority from the right direction and hearing a message that they should have heard that's basically glorifying Jesus, and instead they were glorifying people. And so he was correcting all of that. Well, this time he's contending not for his apostleship so much as he's contending for the revelation that he had regarding faith and grace. And he's battling a situation in Galatia where, in this region, Judaizers, who are people coming in saying, to really be a believer, to really be a Christian, you need to follow the laws of Moses. You need to be circumcised. And so it's kind of odd. We have a whole book on like circumcision. Here we got, it's kind of opposing the idea, but Paul's defending his gospel in view of these other Jewish folks that are coming into the region and telling them, in order to be a real Christian, you've got to be circumcised. So Paul contends that it's by the faith of Abraham, that Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him as righteousness, that we become heirs to the promise and receive our justification from sins. And so he's introducing he's defending his gospel that he's preached. And so he begins this book with the forcefulness that he did in 2 Corinthians too. He says, Paul, an apostle, and remember, I've contended for this over the years a lot. It doesn't say Apostle Paul. It's not a title. It's a function that he operates in. We have a lot of people today put the titles on their name, get themselves a little card and call themselves Apostle so-and-so. Paul was never called Apostle Paul in the Bible. He was called Paul, an apostle. It was describing what he did. Not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. So he's establishing his credentials here. He's saying, I didn't just get this from human agency. I was given a revelation. The agency through which I was made an apostle was through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. And of course, the resurrection message is always key in the New Testament. They preach Jesus and the resurrection from the dead. And so he gives a little greeting here to start out with, and glorifies the Lord who gave himself for our sins and delivered us out of this present evil age. And then in verse 6, he starts with this, a pretty strong exhortation. He says, I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. And so here he's really just hitting this thing head on. He's saying, I presented to you the grace of Christ and the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, and you're going for a different one already. He says, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even though we, or an angel from heaven, should preach to you a gospel contrary to that which we have preached to you, let him be accursed. That's pretty strong language here. Paul's very passionate about the fact that we're saved by this grace of God through faith in him and not by the works of the law. Now, Paul didn't deny us doing deeds or doing actions, but he said we're not justified by the works of the law. And as we get in more and more into Galatians, specifically, it came down to not justified by being circumcised. You don't become part of the faith by being circumcised. It says that was a sign that you are a believer. It didn't make you a believer. So in verse 9 he says, as we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to that which you received, let him be accursed or anathema. And so strong language here. And so a lot of people have seen this and related it to, in our time, the message that came to what's become the Mormon church through an angel, but I forgot the name right now. Can't remember his name, but anyway, the angel that came and especially gave a message, and so they relate back to this in Galatians, say, if it's a different gospel, even if an angel from heaven preaches it, count them accursed. And so it's a thing we need to heed even in these days, and maybe particularly in these days. He goes on and he's kind of defending his ministry here in verse 12. He says, he's talking once again how he received this message. He said, verse 12, for I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And so he goes on after this, and he begins to talk about his life before Christ and how he was actually a persecutor of the church. He was actually pursuing Christians to kill them. I mean, Paul was passionate in whatever he did. He just had whatever message he had, he went after it. And his first message was these Christians are perverting, Judaism. And so he went after it with a passion and was even trying to eliminate them. And as I've said before, I think just the fact that he was the greatest persecutor of the church made the church pray for him all the more, because Jesus said, pray for those who persecute you. And I think, so the church was probably fervently praying for Paul in those days. So God saved this one who was persecuting the church, and all of a sudden he began to preach the very thing that he was standing against. And so he says in the end of chapter 1 that although the churches didn't know him, they kept hearing. In verse 23, they kept hearing, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith which he once tried to destroy, and they were glorifying God because of me. So that, he's saying that the great transformation that took place in his life as God revealed, the way he puts it, I think in verse maybe around 15, God revealed his son in me. Verse 16, that I might preach the gospel. He's talking the story how God revealed Christ Jesus in him. And it's this amazing transformation. So he kind of begins with that same thing. In chapter 2, it says, verse 1, then after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. And it was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. So he took his message to the leaders of the Jerusalem church, to Peter, James, John, those types, and some of maybe the other elders that were in the city, and he's submitting his gospel to them, and he's saying, just in case I might have gotten this in vain, maybe it's not true. But I don't think Paul ever really had a question about that, but he did it out of respect and honor, because as he's contending here, I didn't get this message from man. I wasn't taught the message. I got it as a revelation for heaven. And he talks, we looked in 2 Corinthians where he talked about he knew a man who was caught up into the third heaven. He's talking about himself. And so I don't think he's really questioning the truthfulness or veracity of his message. I think he's just kind of saying, out of respect, he came and presented it to those that were in Jerusalem. And he says, verse 6, but from those who are of high reputation, what they were to me makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Well, those who are of reputation contributed nothing to me. That sounds a little bit like maybe arrogant almost, but you watch Paul's progress through the scriptures, and he's talking about I'm not any less than the most eminent of the apostles, and by the time it's done, he's like, I'm the worst of sinners. And I think you see a humility working in Paul's life as he progressed through the New Testament. By the time it's over, he's realizing, it really is the grace of God working in me. It's not me. And here he's saying, what he's trying to establish here, though, is the message that I have is just as valid as the message of those others that are there. So in verse 7 it says, but on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given me, James and Cephas, which is Peter, and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So he's establishing that they did come to an agreement there, and they were satisfied with his gospel and said, you go to the Gentiles, we're going to the Jews, we're going to the circumcised. And then he adds this one last thing here, which is prominent in the scriptures. It says, verse 10, they only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing that I also was eager to do. So he's saying, they accepted the gospel. They said, one thing, take care of the poor. And he said, that's what we're going to do anyway.